Hey guys, these are our notes about writing equations of a sine and cosine curve. Table of contents, slide 8 and 9, just writing equations. At the top of your paper, you can put your title. You don't have to write down your essential question, but we want to be able to answer what key features do you need to know to write the equation of a sine or cosine graph, and how do you know which equation to use. Go ahead and write down writing equations from given information. So you're going to be using either a sine or cosine equation. Okay, they look the same, so I'm not going to write two equations. I'm just going to write sine, cosine. You decide which one you need to use. But here's what our equation looks like. So a few of your problems are going to give you just a description. It's just going to tell you about the problem. So instead of giving you a picture, they give you words. So what you're going to have to do is determine, the key features or the pieces that you'd plug in for your key features. So A, if you recall from yesterday, is your amplitude. In the description, though, they might not call it the amplitude. They might say something like it rises above or falls below. They're going to give you some sort of description of the graph. The other thing that they're going to give you is your midline. That's your K. Instead of midline, though, you might hear it mentioned as a vertical shift. So if you hear the words or read the words vertical shift, they're talking about the midline. Something we didn't use a whole lot yesterday was your H. This is your phase shift, or they call it your, not vertical, your horizontal shift. But when they're giving a description, they might talk about moving left or right instead of talking about it as the horizontal shift. And the last thing is B. They're not going to say just B is equal to this. They're either going to give you the period or the frequency. So you have to remember that B is equal to 2 pi divided by the period, or B is equal to 2 pi times the frequency. So we're going to go ahead and do an example right now where they're going to give us information and we're going to draw an equations or write an equation. So you're going to go ahead and grab your workbook. This is on page 97 of unit 3, and we're going to do example number 1. Find the equation of a sine function with no horizontal shift whose frequency is 2. The function rises 3 units above its midline, which is y equals -1. So in this problem, they say determine the value of a, b, c, and d. We don't use a, b, c, and d. We use a, b, h, and k. So you can change those pieces. So we're going to read our information and then just kind of find those 4 key things that we need. So when you read your problem, it says find the equation of a sine function. So that's good. We need to know if we're using sine or cosine. And then it says there is no horizontal shift. So the letter H is your horizontal shift. And if it says there is no horizontal shift, that means that your H is 0. Then it mentions frequency. It says the frequency is 2. Well, frequency is not B, but B is equal to 2 pi times the frequency. So when we're finding B, we're going to multiply 2 pi times 2, and that means that our B is equal to 4 pi. The next one, or the next part of the equation says it rises 3 units above. So that is your amplitude, even though it doesn't say the word amplitude. Our amplitude is 3 because it's how much it rises above and below the midline. And then it says that the midline is the line y equals -1. So that is my K. My K is -1. So I read through the problem. It didn't give me like B equals this. It didn't say H equals this, but I was able to find those 4 things. So the last thing we need to do is go ahead and put them into the sine function, which is a sine of B x minus H plus K. So I'm going to plug my pieces in. So we know A is 3. We know B is 4 pi. X minus H, which is 0. You technically don't have to write it. You could just close your parentheses. Some people don't even put the parentheses. And then my K is -1, and I'm done. The next thing you're going to do, or your next few problems are going to be write an equation from a graph. So I'm going to write down some steps kind of to help us. The first thing you want to do, okay, we're going to write the equation still. We're going to use the same exact equation. The first two things you're going to find is your midline and your amplitude. So find midline, which is your K, and amplitude, which is your A. Then after you have those two things, you're going to go ahead and decide if you're using sine or cosine using the y-intercept. Okay, so I'm going to decide if I'm using sine or cosine based on my y-intercept. Because if your 5 critical points, if your first critical point lies on the midline, right? If it lies on the midline, then that is a sine curve. I didn't hit very nice. Let me redraw. If your, I'm gonna try mid. If your first point is at a maximum on the y-axis, that means that you have a cosine curve. Oh, it didn't look very nice either. So if your first point is on the y-axis at a maximum, that means you're using a cosine curve. So if it's at a midline, you're using sine. If it's at a maximum, you're using cosine. If it is neither, you can use sine or cosine. You're just going to have a horizontal shift. If your piece, your y-intercept is at a midline or a maximum, that just means you're not going to have a horizontal shift. But if you have neither, if it's not at a maximum or the midline, that just means you're going to have a horizontal shift. After that, you can go ahead and just find b using 2 pi divided by the period. And then once you have all of your pieces, you can plug them in. So plug in A, B, H, and K into your equation, the same one we have above. So it could be sine or cosine depending on which one you chose, but all the other pieces are the same. The last thing I need to talk about before we do our last 2 examples is if you had a negative a value. So if you had a negative sine curve, your negative sine curve will still start at the midline, but instead of going up first, it's going to go down first. And if you have a negative cosine curve, instead of starting from max to max, it's actually going to go minimum to minimum. So a normal sine curve goes up first and then down, but a negative sine curve goes down first and then up. A positive cosine curve goes max to max, but a negative cosine curve goes minimum to minimum. We're going to go do 2 more examples, so I need you to go ahead and we're going to go out of order. I'm actually going to do example number 3 first. It's on page 99, and then I'll go back and do example 2. So example 3 says the following graph shows historical average monthly temperatures for the town of Mayersville starting in January 2000. Write an equation for the graph function. So here's January, right? It's cold. It's winter. And then the months later it becomes spring, and then it's hot, it's in the summer, and then it becomes a fall, it cools down, then you get to the winter, and then it goes back to the spring, and so on. So the temperatures are represented by a periodic function. So we're going to go ahead and remember it can be a sine or cosine curve. We're first going to start by finding our midline and amplitude. So our midline is going to be halfway in between our minimum and maximum. My minimum is at 12, my maximum is at 28, so directly in between those would be 20. That's my K. My amplitude is how far I go from my midline up to my maximum or down below. It's just half of, the total distance, so my amplitude is 8. So I find those two things first, and now I'm going to decide if I want a sine or cosine curve. Okay, so I look at my y-intercept. My y-intercept's right here. I am not on the midline, so it is not sine. I am not at the maximum, so it's not cosine. So I can use either, okay? So I can use either one. On your homework, you get to pick which one you want to use. For our notes, I'm just going to write both. So on your homework, you do not have to write both, but for our examples, we're going to write two equations. The only thing that's going to be different in the whole entire equation is your h. That's going to be the only difference between the sine and cosine equations. The amplitude is the same, the midline doesn't change, the period doesn't change, so a, b, and k are the same. The only thing that will change is our horizontal shift. So our horizontal shift for your sine curve, remember sine curves normally start at the midline. So here's my first midline point. Well, what we do is we look at how far is that point from the x-axis. Well, if you look at the little tick marks, each little box is 2. So that means that my h would be equal to 4. If I was using sine, because sine is normally at the midline. Then if I was going to write a cosine equation, cosine is normally at the maximum. So I just see how far my max is from the y-axis. So each box is 2, so I have 2, 4, 6, plus 1. So my horizontal shift is 7. So remember, your a, b, and k are going to stay the same. The only thing that changes from a cosine and sine is your h. And your horizontal shift is just how far the midline and how far the maximum is from the y-axis. So here's your y-axis, right? So you're just seeing how far it is from there. Last thing we need to find is b. So b, if you recall, is equal to 2 pi divided by the period. The period is how long it takes to complete one full curve. So it doesn't matter if it's sine or cosine, but you can always use max to find your period. And then remember, each box is 2, so I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then 1 on each side. So my period is 12. 2 pi divided by 12, which reduces to pi over 6. So as you recall, our a, b, and k are all going to stay the same for my equations, okay? So just writing my equation is like the skeleton part. Okay, so my amplitude was 8. So both of my equations have an amplitude of 8. My b value, okay, my b value is pi over 6. That does not change for either equation. The only thing that changes is my horizontal shift. So for sine it was 4, for cosine it was 7. And then the last piece of information is my midline, which was 20. So I have 2 equations for your homework. You do not have to write both, but they are exactly the same. The only thing that's different is their horizontal shift. Last example, number 2. This is on page 98. All right, we're going to go ahead and write the equation of the graph described. So I'm going to find my midline and my amplitude to start. So this one hopefully pretty easy. You guys can see that the midline is at 3. That's your k. Your amplitude is how far you move up or down. So that was just 1. Now I'm going to decide if I use a sine or cosine curve. So when I look at my point, I notice that my point is at a minimum. Maximum means cosine, right? Max means cosine. Midline means sine. But a minimum actually means that we can use a negative cosine and have no phase shift at all. So if I have a minimum, I could use a negative cosine and have no phase shift at all. So instead of a positive a, I'm going to use a negative a, and I'm going to use a cosine with no horizontal shift. I'm going to go ahead and find my last piece. So I know a, b, no, I know a, h, and k. I just need to find b, which is 2 pi divided by the period. Remember, the period is how long it takes to complete one curve. So I'm using a negative cosine curve, so I can go max to max, How long is that horizontal distance? Well, it's from 0 to pi. When I plug in pi, it cancels, so I'm just left with 2. So my equation, f of x equals, it's going to be a -1 cosine. B was 2. X minus h ended up being 0 because I used a negative cosine, so I'm just not even going to write plus 0. And then my k value was 3. I could write multiple equations for this one problem. I would have the same a, okay, I could keep a, b, and k, and I could write it as a sine equation. I would just have a horizontal shift right here. I could write it as a cosine equation. I would have a horizontal shift here, but since I was on the y-axis at a minimum, I'm just using my h as 0. All right, well, that was our last problem. You're going to do, or put it into your digital notebook. The notes part goes on slide 8, page 97, and then on slide 9, page 98 and 99, example 2 and 3. Your homework is page 103, I believe, 1 through 10. Okay, that's it.